Hello, welcome everybody. So I will be providing my own personal view of a China perspective, covering the COVID-19 situation locally, an overview of the aerospace landscape, and then at the end we can have some Q&A questions. Now, hopefully you've been studying this picture because it's a collage really of all of the currently ongoing commercial aircraft projects that are ongoing in China. And I'd like to focus first of all on this aircraft. It's the AVIC AG600. It's the world's largest amphibious aircraft. And I was actually asked by AVIC to advise them on this project. And so I know the aircraft very well. Why it's significant is because the production version of this aircraft will have a full digital, full authority fly-by-wire system, the latest glass cockpit and integrated modular avionics. The passenger cabin will be fully pressurized and can accommodate 50 passengers as part of its firefighting and sea rescue roles. The engines are all manufactured locally. They're a derivative of a Russian design. Why it's significant is that I think it's a very good indicator of the current capability within China, because all of the systems, the engines, the airframe will be entirely produced in China. All of the development activities, the certification activities, and manufacturing will all be undertaken locally. And so this is a fair representation, I think, of where China is at the moment, because apart from a little bit of input from people like myself, it is a total Chinese program. This is the COMAC ARJ21. There are 25 aircraft now in revenue service on domestic routes within China. And for the last 3 years, COMAC has been going through a very challenging learning exercise of just what it means to support your own product in regular revenue service. This aircraft is, of course, the COMAC C919. We've got 6 aircraft flying at the moment in the flight test program, using 3 separate flight test centers around China. This picture shows you the joint venture wide-body aircraft program, and it's a joint venture between COMAC of China and UAC of Russia. COMAC are responsible for the fuselage and empennage. Russia will be responsible for the wing. Final assembly will take place in China. And the current status is that the aircraft is in the joint definition phase, with engine selection and supplier selection ongoing. Now, there certainly have been delays already to this program, and of course, the inability to continue with the joint co-location of the 2 teams because of the COVID-19 situation has certainly not helped progress. This picture shows a family of the AVIC helicopter developments. And the strategy has been to align and in fact have a joint venture with each of the major helicopter OEMs in terms of developing a specific product. And that's resulted in a complete family of commercial helicopters. But you'll notice that most of them seem to be based on older designs, and that has been the strategy from the overseas OEMs. So you'll notice the Spatial Dauphin, the Super Phalon that's in the background. And that's been the mechanism by which the OEMs have protected their intellectual property, is by only offering the last generation of aircraft. The aircraft at the bottom is the AVIC MA700. It's a 80-seat turboprop aircraft, and the first airframe was recently moved into the full-scale structural test facility, and the first flying prototype is due to be rolled out in a few months' time. This engine picture is of the Aircraft Commercial Engine Company, also based in Shanghai, and they're developing an alternative power plant to the LEAP engine that's currently used on the COMAC C919. And indeed, in parallel, they're also developing an equivalent wide-body engine to be used on the CR929. They're also in a joint venture with Safran, developing turboshaft engines for the fleet of helicopter developments. And in fact, a whole family of turboshaft engines is under development. So let's look at the status of the coronavirus locally. The chart on the left shows you the confirmed cases within the Chinese mainland, and you'll notice that for around a month or so, the daily intake of new cases has been in single figures. And when you think that there's a population of 1.4 billion people, that's quite some success, really. And unfortunately, when you compare it with the chart on the right, which depicts the top 6 countries in terms of the most confirmed cases, of course, it makes grim reading, really, and especially the upper line, which denotes the USA. It's tragic, to be honest, in terms of just how long it's going to take for them to get through the coronavirus cycle. But also note, significantly, the red and yellow lines, which denote Russia and Brazil, because they're still on a very upward trajectory. But what it does mean, apart from the very significant human impact this is going to have in those zones, it actually means that the regional transport, i.e. the domestic flying and international flying from the US, from Russia, from Brazil, is clearly going to be some considerable time before they get through the cycle and have the ability to open up the airways again. And from a Russian point of view, of course, this will have a direct bearing on how we manage our ongoing project with UAC, i.e. the CR929. So China has successfully exited the coronavirus cycle. Children are back at school, students back at colleges, all businesses are basically running normally again. We still all wear masks, in fact, during the working day, and our temperature is measured as we enter the facility every day. But you can play sports, the sports centers are open, and even I noticed the Disney Entertainment Center, Activity Center, the gates are now opened again. There are 3 vaccines undergoing trials. However, there's still restrictions on entry into China, and anyone that does enter is actually tested. And even if you're tested negatively, you still have to be quarantined for 14 days in a government designated hotel. So when we look a bit closer in terms of the domestic flight situation, the chart here clearly shows the comparison between China and the United States, with a delay on grounding the fleets in the United States. But it also shows the fairly good recovery, in fact, excellent recovery in terms of the Chinese domestic market. And although it quotes 80% here, in reality, virtually all of the routes are now functioning again. It's the daily frequency that's not quite got up to pre-virus levels. The load factors are running around 64% compared to an average of around 88% for the virus. Now, of course, Europe is in the middle of those 2 curves, but I hear from most of the European airlines that they are hoping to begin services again either late June or early July. Indeed, China is in negotiation with a number of countries to begin international flights again, even as early as this week. They've selected what are deemed to be low risk from a coronavirus point of view countries, and even Emirates, I believe, are pioneering the principle of testing every passenger before they check in. Excuse me. Now, China has, of course, huge financial reserves, and these have certainly been used to support not only the airlines, but businesses in general across China. And indeed, the whole scenario has opened up the political possibility to look at some consolidation of airlines within China, and Hainan Airlines are a likely opportunity to do that. So what does that mean globally? Well, everyone's focusing on the impact on aircraft deliveries, and whilst Airbus and Boeing have not fully defined their multi-year planning, frankly, I think they're still trying to understand exactly what it should be. But I do believe the industry is consolidated and converged down to a graph similar to this, which is grim reading, but it does show an immediate reduction of 50% or more in terms of deliveries, with recovery taking 4 or 5 years in most circles. But actually, this graph denotes it could be as much as 10 years before we return to 2019 levels. So, but it's not only this drastic reduction and deferral of new aircraft orders and deliveries. Of course, there's been an associated drop in maintenance and after sales activities, not only because of the grounding, but because of the slower recovery of the various fleets. And I think everyone listening to this will be facing a very similar situation where the whole supply chain is now going to face an immediate reduction of between 30 and in some cases more than 50% reduction of order intake in the short term. So excess capacity and headcount is a global issue, but it's not such a problem in China, and that's a simple reason is they're not so dependent on Airbus, Boeing, and the related engine companies in terms of orders. So now we take a bit more of a general overview of the industry, and really it's important to appreciate the significance of the order book of Chinese airlines with Airbus and Boeing. Before the virus epidemic, they were taking over 25% of all production. And certainly those numbers are going to fall as we have that dip in delivery performance. But actually, because the recovery in China, both domestically and from international, and the resulting reduced effect on the domestic airlines is surely going to mean that the actual overall percentage of whatever is delivered by Airbus and Boeing is going to be higher. And frankly, my finger in the air estimate is it could be as much as 35% of all production will actually come to Chinese airlines in the near future. China has a strategy of reducing their dependency upon overseas companies. It's a very clear strategy. And that includes technology advancement and hence the huge support for commercial aerospace. And unfortunately for the USA, there's something here we call the Trump factor. The trade war, and of course more recently the arguments regarding how the virus originated, is certainly influencing central government attitude towards allowing state-owned businesses to continue to do business and place contracts with companies from the US. I've given an overview of the three major programs with COMAC, and indeed on the 929, there certainly are supply opportunities in airframe systems and of course on board whichever engine is actually selected for the program. Now the fact there's airframe opportunities is very significant because the previous two COMAC aircraft airframes were designed and manufactured totally locally, or at least with Chinese-owned companies such as FACT. And the reason was simple. They were basic traditional metallic-based airframes, where the 929 is essentially an all-composite design, both fuselage and wing. And in fact, it's adopted the Airbus A350 concept in terms of fuselage configuration. China recognized they simply don't have the maturity in terms of that technology, and so they've accepted they need to invite appropriately experienced companies to participate on the program in the form of joint ventures with local structure suppliers in terms of providing various sections of the airframe. The commercial engine company, also based in Shanghai, as I mentioned, is developing companion alternative engine programs for all of the COMAC and AVIC products. And certainly there are opportunities for the supply chain for all elements of the propulsion system, the turbo machinery, the nacelle and structures, and of course all the systems. Certainly intellectual property transfer is a challenge and needs to be managed appropriately. Unfortunately, the AG600 and MA700 projects, all the suppliers are selected. And similarly with the range of helicopter programs. There are other interesting programs ongoing. For example, there's a number of conversions underway, converting existing aircraft to remotely piloted vehicles. And China Post has already been operating trial runs for both onshore and offshore deliveries from as early as last year. And I think it is recognized that China does lead the way in terms of small commercial drone design, manufacture, and delivery projects. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, despite the very wide range of Chinese military and space programs, overseas companies are not eligible. It is important, though, that you do understand that the state-owned companies, and that includes the airlines, Commercial Aircraft Corporation, and the engine company, do require local manufacture or at least assembly, preferably through local joint ventures, as part of the condition of issuing contracts to overseas suppliers. Now, all of you may not be aware, but both Airbus and Boeing do actually complete aircraft within China. It's most unfortunate from the case of the 737 MAX, because just about at the time of the grounding, the joint venture and a brand new facility, including runway, was completed just south of Shanghai, a joint venture between Boeing and COMAC for the final completions and delivery of the 737 MAX. But it is hoped that, of course, when the grounding is lifted of 737, that deliveries will recommence later this year. Airbus do undertake final assembly of the A320 in China, in addition to the final completion. And indeed, they've already completed the first batch of A330s locally. And they don't only deliver to Chinese airlines, they've also commenced deliveries to regional Asian airlines. And Airbus have already committed that they will undertake completions of A350 also in the Tianjin facility. But what does completion mean? It means installation of the interiors, painting of the aircraft, and the customer delivery. So green aircraft are flown into China, and the interiors and so on takes place prior to delivery. Interiors are seen as a low intellectual property risk, and they have considerable value, which is very relevant, and I'll explain why shortly. I can confirm that COMAC is facilitating and supporting local competence and capability with regard to aircraft interiors, with the intention of using them to support all of the COMAC aircraft programs. Because there are such a huge number of aircraft that's ordered and will be used by Chinese airlines, both Airbus and Boeing are under obligations to increase the value of their supply chain in China in order to meet contractual industrial offset obligations. But when we look outside of China, certainly one of the major, I feel, opportunities for the supply chain in general, as well as being a very exciting addition to a traditional project, is the huge number, more than 200 actually, of electrical propulsion and electrical vertical takeoff and landing aircraft projects that are ongoing globally. And certainly I was very pleased to see the UK is also providing support through its Future Flight Challenge. Indeed, the Aeronautical Society has itself got its own design competition running at the moment. EASA has issued many special conditions to support the certification of these new classes of aircraft, and there are similar initiatives ongoing in the US through the FAA. Well, it's very significant that the US military is providing significant funding for the most promising projects. And it's not only the OEMs. Toyota and Hyundai are two major automotive companies, and they've both committed $1.5 billion on the one side and almost 700 million US dollars for their respective projects in this new area of aerospace. And there are some very well-funded startups, and just a few of them are Alice in Israel, Voltairo in France, Volocopter and Lilium in Germany. And Lilium, by the way, are being funded to the tune of $340 million, predominantly by a company Tencent in China. Vertical Aerospace in the UK, of course, and then there's a very innovative personal transport project that's ongoing in Japan called SkyDrive. But in China, it's EHang that lead the way in electrical vertical and takeoff and landing, and they're far more advanced than almost anybody else, really. Last year, they delivered 34 of their two-seat vehicle to various cities around the world. And each city is undergoing operational evaluation and infrastructure development. And recently they signed up Seville in Spain and a city in Norway to undertake similar activities. And it's fair to say the Volocopter in Germany are also very quickly moving towards a similar level of evaluation in many parts around the world. Other opportunities, certainly there's many blue sky and clean sky initiatives ongoing, not least being the tilt rotor program being headed by Leonardo in Italy. Dassault haven't officially announced it, but they are developing a very large business jet called the 10X. Although, like all the other business OEMs, they've certainly been affected by the coronavirus situation, so it's not clear how that project will be affected. Aerion have recently completed their first batch of Tier 1 supplier selection. The Boom have recently mated their wing to the fuselage of their 1/3 scale demonstrator. And there's a whole series of military fighter programs ongoing around the world. And there are some companion military helicopter projects underway also. But whilst this list is far from conclusive, and there's certainly a number of general aviation projects that are ongoing as well. But frankly, in my 40 years of experience, I've never known the industry so lacking in major commercial aircraft development programs. So if you take stock of what is active currently and what's available from a supply opportunity point of view, you're really left with the electric hybrid set of opportunities, and of course the CR929 and the Chinese commercial engine company. I also do firmly believe that aircraft interiors offer a significant opportunity to support the Airbus and Boeing aircraft completion in China, and there will still be a significant number of cabin retrofits and upgrades, and I'll talk more about that in detail. My view, and it's my only personal view, is that the financial pressures and stresses that are now clearly being felt by the whole industry, not least being Airbus and Boeing, in my view means that the next likely major development from both those companies will actually be re-engine programs of the A350 and the 787. I just can't see in the short term how either party can afford a completely new aircraft development program, and certainly the supply chain will struggle to provide the funding and resources to support it also. But it would mean at least an opportunity for the Rolls-Royce UltraFan and of course the next generation of GE engines. Going back to interiors, I was very pleased to see the initiative launched by the Aerospace Technology Institute, mainly to use the very well-established supply basis that you see in the UK, but actually there's an equivalent well-established framework for interior suppliers in Europe. Why are interiors so important? And remember, we are talking China as well. 2019, the global interiors market was valued at $19 billion. And even though there is going to be this dip the next 3 to 5 years, bearing in mind, I'm expecting the percentage of aircraft deliveries to China to increase from 25% to maybe as much as 35%, you're still talking around a $7 billion opportunity in China alone. You do need to appreciate that a wide-body aircraft costs around 4 times the price of a narrow-body aircraft, and that deliveries tend to be around 50-50 split between new aircraft line fit deliveries and cabin retrofits and upgrades. Aircraft interiors are made up of around 12 individual elements, from seats all the way through to emergency equipment, and this graph does give you an indication of the relative value within each shipset. So a single aisle aircraft interior costs in the region of $5 million and a twin aisle aircraft interior around $20 million. Despite the financial pressures on the airlines, I do believe there will be overwhelming pressure to improve the hygiene features within cabins. And that means air purification, antibacterial coatings and all the touch surfaces in the cabin. There'll be ultraviolet cleaning of lavatories and even possibly the cabins itself in between flights, and non-touch features for operating items such as taps and toilet flush and even possibly door opening. So if you intend to enter the China market, or perhaps you're here already and you're looking to increase the business of what is going to be the fastest recovering market, what sort of thing do you need to understand and consider? Well, the first thing is to really appreciate that the central government view commercial aircraft and commercial aerospace as one of the pillars of the future success of China. And consequently, the ongoing investment, especially at COMAC, is remarkable to say the least. I mentioned the 3 flight test centers supporting the C919 activities. Our final assembly facility out in Pudong Airport has we now have 2 production lines for ARJ21. State-of-the-art production line for C919 is waiting and ready, and the groundbreaking has already started for the infrastructure requirements for the 929. In fact, the Shanghai government reclaimed land from the sea just to build us our own dedicated runway, a 5th runway at Pudong International Airport. For people who haven't been to the engineering center in COMAC, it's a huge campus. The engineering building is 5 floors high, half a kilometer long. You know, the level of investment that's being undertaken, of course, on the military side as well as the commercial side, is quite incredible here. And you could only dream of such commitment in Europe or the US. Actually, though, I only wish the same investment was being made on people's tools and resources. And that's the biggest problem I have operating in China. And that's one of the major reasons why it's taking time for the Chinese industry to become competitive. China is still a low-cost, high-quality solution. And that's really being driven by the automotive sector because they're very much cost-driven. And all the major automotive OEMs operate in China, and certainly the supply chain supports everyone from Rolls-Royce downwards. So quality and quality control is certainly not an issue. However, in the metropolis areas in China, certainly salaries and the overall overheads are increasing. And I am aware of some transitioning now out of these high-cost areas into lower-cost Asian countries, and in particular Vietnam and Laos, I think, very popular at the moment. So if you are considering moving into China, then you need to be very careful on where you position your facilities, especially regarding manufacturing. As part of the long scale or long view intentions of the government, they have created these primary development zones. And that's all about promoting technology development and IP creation. And indeed, all regions of China will offer substantial funding and a whole range of practical benefits to encourage any business looking to enter the Chinese market to choose their region as the basis for that. And of course, they're particularly interested in what tax revenues you're going to generate and what IP you're either bringing with you or you're intending to create as part of the activities within the country. However, these policies and benefits are anything but black and white, and I've assisted a number of companies through this minefield, and they're deliberately grey. And that might sound strange, but the thinking is that they want to provide flexibility. They want to work with whoever is evaluating a move into China to sit down and to tailor a specific package in order to maximize the benefit for both sides, but especially suiting the needs of the business involved. So there is a need to be very physical in terms of sitting with the various regions to develop those solutions. It's very difficult to do it remotely. There are 2 main mechanisms of creating business in China. One is via joint ventures, and the second option is through what's termed wholly owned foreign enterprises. And Tesla, the car manufacturer, are the best recent example of a wholly owned foreign enterprise. The new Gigafactory that's been churning out their Model 3 car since January is a wholly owned foreign enterprise. But that still didn't stop hundreds of millions of dollars of subsidy being provided to encourage Tesla to choose, in this case, Shanghai as the basis for this new factory. So whilst the process is a bit challenging and complicated in terms of completing the registration, assistance is available, and in fact I've personally completed it a number of times already, so don't be put off by what appears to be a complicated process. COMAC itself can't cope with tier 2 supplier interfacing. They just don't have the capacity to do that. So if you are a traditional 2-tier supplier, you need to consider a sub-tier or collaboration consortium approach, and preferably through a joint venture would be the sentiment you'd hear from COMAC. But I would encourage you to seek out businesses, overseas businesses that are already well established in China. A, because they'll fast track you into the market, it will reduce your investment, lower your risk, and certainly they can share with you all their hard-earned experience of the reality of operating in China. However, the commercial engine company are more open to tier 2 relationships because they recognize that a lot of the specific engine specialist expertise actually lies within the smaller companies who traditionally are tier 2 suppliers. So there are certainly opportunities for the smaller companies who are engine related. The one thing that is common, and it is essential that you understand, is that if you're working, cooperating, or even supplying to any of the state-owned enterprises, and that includes COMAC, AVIC, and the commercial engine company, then it's operationally is very, very difficult. And although you have lots of local agents saying they've got all the relationships and all the contacts and you don't need to worry, in my experience, they are rarely successful, and all they do is add a very expensive markup on top of whatever it already is a very challenging business case. But you do need this local knowledge, political connections, and so on. But we haven't got time here on this session to go through those, but it is essential. Of course, IP protection is always a question. It is important, and it does need to be managed, but it's certainly not a stumbling block to engaging and undertaking any activities within the country. And China is introducing a whole range of protection measures to provide confidence that intellectual property is being protected and managed appropriately. So what is the summary? Well, China is certainly recovering better than I would say anywhere else in the world in terms of getting through COVID-19, both operationally and economically. I certainly believe that this recovery will mean that certainly in the short term, the Chinese aviation market will become even more significant. It is important you understand that it's the long-term objectives that are driving the support for these the current aerospace projects that are ongoing, and therefore they're not based on traditional commercial principles. And this needs to be taken advantage of in terms of creating a business model that is viable. And certainly there are real opportunities on the CR929 and the commercial aircraft company, and non-recurring costs can be paid. You're not expected to amortize over production deliveries. The level of non-recurring support is usually decided as a function of what value you're bringing to the program and what level of intellectual property you're willing to bring into the country. And I firmly believe that aircraft interiors offer real opportunities in China, and there's substantial support is available for new entrants. I'd certainly recommend the wholly owned foreign enterprise approach rather than joint ventures. It certainly offers the best business case, and that is, of course, if it's politically accepted on a case-by-case basis. Also, one of the major advantages is if you don't have a Chinese partner, you don't have the intellectual property problem. Please seek out overseas companies that are already active in China. They can certainly expedite your entry into the market. Despite my best efforts, and certainly from similar overseas colleagues within China, but I can assure you it's the same in all of the state-owned enterprises, introducing and actually achieving adoption of industry best practice tools and methods, and that means management processes, is proving very, very difficult. The best analogy is a super tanker, and I'm a very small rudder at the back of this huge ship, and I'm afraid it doesn't change direction very quickly. And what that means is that you need to recognize that and have a different way of thinking, a different way of working, and a different business relationship. Because you do need to understand what we call guanxi, which is that special relationship you do need to develop. And I wouldn't, at face value, recommend local agents to achieve that for you. Remember, it's not about being the cheapest solution. It's about providing the best value to the project. And of course, they've got very different objectives to what you would traditionally expect from an OEM. So your business case and operating budgets need to compensate for the inefficiencies in working, the delays in decisions, and certainly delays in the project. Intellectual property is a risk, but it can certainly be managed. GE, for example, have been operating in China for 45 years on a whole range of industries, and they manage just fine. It's certainly not a showstopper or should not be a barrier to entry into the China market, but you do need to respect that it needs to be protected appropriately. So my view is that China certainly offers new market opportunities for some. And for people already engaged in China, I do believe it offers an opportunity to diversify products and hopefully to reallocate some of those people and resources that have been so badly affected by COVID-19. So this is the question that I invariably get asked time and time again. But seriously, don't see the management of intellectual property as a barrier to entry. So I've shown these two pictures. The one on the left is me receiving the China Friendship Award from the Premier of China. It's in the Great Hall of the People. It was on national television. The one on the right is a screenshot from national TV, and it's because I was personally invited to discuss with the President of China how to improve operational effectiveness in COMAC. Now, it's important you understand, these are not about me. These events were orchestrated to demonstrate the significance of COMAC, the importance of COMAC in the national aspirations of becoming a serious player in the commercial aircraft industry, and the high-level commitment, the total commitment that's being provided by central government into that endeavor. And it's really important that that is appreciated. So now, thank you very much. I'd like to finish there and move into Q&A.
Dennis, thank you very much. A wealth of really useful and important advice for both those contemplating business in China and even those who are already there. Please, can I ask the audience to keep the questions coming in, and I'll endeavour to slice and dice so we get some themes going. One theme, excuse me, well, one theme you've touched on in some depth is intellectual property, but there are others around joint venturing. So if I take it under three headings, so when it comes to a decision around joint venturing, what is the situation for private capital in China? What is actually the robustness of the intellectual property regime? And to what degree does politics play a part in selectively applying the rules?
All big questions, actually. And the most important one was the last one. Because if you are engaging, for example, with COMAC on the 929, you will be guided. Suggestions will be made on who you should be undertaking a joint venture with. And so, of course, you want to try and oblige your customer. And so and what tends to happen then is essentially a shotgun marriage in terms of you enter openly into dialogue with whoever's been suggested and so on, and you do your very best to create a business framework that both sides can live with. Unfortunately, the political aspect tends to influence the proposed partner from the Chinese side. And so what we found on the 929 so far, certainly through last year and this year, is that very few of the proposed marriages have actually resulted in formal agreements. And that's because, well, there's many reasons why, from technical competence to the actual business conditions that are being requested and so on and so on. So my real advice, and in fact, I was only talking to one of the potential structure suppliers only 2 days ago. What you really need to do is, of course, you do attempt to comply, as it were, with the wishes that's being fed to you by COMAC, but also undertake your own assessment on what is the most suitable partner. It may well be you've got some history with someone, or there's a good recommendation from someone in the industry. And you do certainly need not to rush into the first, let's say, proposal, and do your own assessment on who would make the most suitable partner for you to undertake such a critical joint venture with. Because I think it's fair to say that all of the joint ventures that were created for ARJ and C919 all have had their, let's say, difficult periods. And that's through, again, a whole raft of issues, not least being cultural differences, but actually business and really the front-end expectations were not really aligned. So it is important that businesses, when they are recommended to partner with certain businesses, that they don't take that as the only option. I think it's essential, really, that you assess what is the most suitable option, because COMAC in the end are flexible. And if you put a sound proposal on the table, and if it does meet their, let's say, general aspirations, then they will seriously consider that.
Okay, and could you just say a few more words about IP, the degree of robustness there is about the current situation?
I think you have to accept that it is China's aspirations to become self-sufficient, to introduce more competence within the country, locally. It's a clear remit from central government. So of course, they want to learn, they want to understand. And the best examples, I think, are from the rail industry and also shipbuilding. They started as joint ventures, and now certainly China is a global leader in rail systems and shipbuilding. So there's no question of what their end game is. They're not secretive about it. But on the other hand, there are companies that have been operating here for decades. I used the GE example previously. So, and in fact, there was a very interesting chap who had a lifelong career with GE. And 25 years ago, he was sent to China to assess how long would it be before China actually catches up on the commercial aircraft engines. He then came back here 25 years later, in fact, as an invitation from both GE and COMAC. And when he repeated the same exercise, and I had a coffee with him, I said, so how long do you think now? He said, well, about 25 years. So, 25 years down the road, he hadn't seen the projected, let's say, development that his crystal ball had estimated at that time. So it's just important that you are open and honest in terms of, again, it's all about those agreements and expectations at the beginning of this marriage. But make no bones about it. And joint ventures have varied enormously from companies really satisfying the requirement for a joint venture, but really only offering what amounts to take advantage of cheap manufacture with no development, no IP sharing at all. That's at one end of the scale. On the other end of the scale, you've had companies which have created true joint ventures, and Aviage on the avionics system, the IMA system, which is based on 787, that is a genuine joint venture intended to be a global player of integrated avionics systems. But frankly, it's not gone as well as it should. Why? Because there's no revenue stream. So really, the best example I've seen or companies such as Honeywell, for example, where they have a large team in China, but actually 75% of the activity of that team is on non-COMAC related activities. So they haven't got the huge overhead that they're trying to cover with what amounts to very minimal revenue coming from COMAC products. So they have the capability locally, they're training local people, they're ticking the boxes in terms of providing capability enhancement. And they're also reaping the benefits, because make no mistake, COMAC each year, this year alone, we took on 800 new graduates just in 1 year, and it's varied between 500 and 800, and the majority of them have master's degrees, and they come from the very best universities across China. So the intellectual capability of these people are as good as anywhere and better than most. So it is a very capable resource. It just needs to be used in the appropriate way. So again, you have to be very careful of how you structure your business relationship and what work you do here, what work you don't do here, in order to manage IP appropriately.
Yeah, thank you for that. Another theme that's developing, we draw attention to the fact that, say, the last half of 2019, the aviation world was dominated by decarbonisation and the challenge of that, certainly in the Western world. What is the position for COMAC and indeed the Chinese government on promoting global leadership in green aviation? You touched on electric propulsion, but what about hybrid? What about synthetic aviation fuels?
Well, COMAC has a very clear responsibility in the marketplace. It's only responsible for aircraft above 80 seats. AVIC, and hence the MA700 turboprop, is responsible for everything smaller than that. So if you accept that the first steps down the hybrid or electric propulsion route are going to be on smaller aircraft and regional aircraft at best, then that will certainly come under the AVIC domain. And I'm afraid I just don't have the same exposure as to what they're doing. But certainly from a COMAC point of view, yes, we have some innovation projects ongoing. We've flown some blended wing scale models and so on to evaluate aerodynamic configurations, but it's all aimed at the larger aircraft within the scope of COMAC.
And then just looking at the range, particularly the 919-929, and what do you think the potential is for those models in particular to be competitive against the Boeing and Airbus stable? And also, I mean, when is the 919 entry into service?
Well, I think you have to understand the scale of COMAC. Whilst they may have very grand and huge facilities, they're actually only about 13,000 employees. And because in China, they're very, very careful to keep military activity completely separate from commercial activity. And in fact, if an employee leaves a military program and enters a commercial program, he's not allowed to return back into the military environment. You know, that's how serious they're taking about avoiding, let's say, commercial IP being used on military programs. So what that means, actually, two things. One, they simply don't have the capacity. I mean, they've got the 10th of the employees of Airbus or Boeing. And without this military engagement, let's say, as you would find in Boeing in particular, then, of course, you've even less scope for the introduction and cross-fertilization of technologies and so on. So really, if you look at what COMAC is already attempting there will be some major upgrades on the ARJ21 based on its initial in-service experience. We're still struggling to achieve certification on the C919. And of course, they're now embarking already on a major wide-body program. And there's only 13,000 employees. You know, so there simply isn't the depth of capability to worry too much about hydrogen or other propulsion systems, and certainly they're relying on AVIC at this stage. Now, AVIC is a completely different scenario. For those who aren't so familiar, AVIC is huge. It has over 300 individual business units and more than 500,000 employees. Now, it is truly huge. And so I'm sure, of course, that those kind of, let's say, initiatives are ongoing, but I'm afraid I just don't have visibility of those.
There's a lot of interest.
The last question I think you asked was about certification of the 919. The currently publicized schedule was the intention to achieve it next year. Of course, the virus situation did mean we did have an extended shutdown like everywhere else. And it's fair to say we've still got some challenges on the airplane. So I have to wait, I'm afraid, until the company is willing to release any further update.
Okay, thank you. There's a related question to that. In terms of the current global political situation and indeed the aftermath of COVID-19, would COMAC see it more difficult now to get certification in common with, say, FIA and EASA? And separately but related, is this a particular window of opportunity for UK aerospace companies to work in China?
Well, the first one, of course, you just can't get away from the or the political situation between China and the USA. That's clearly got an influence on many levels. But the philosophy of China now is not to have the aircraft certified by either EASA or the FAA, but to have the Civil Aviation Authority themselves to be approved as a certification authority. So it would then be the CAC that undertake the actual certification on an airframe by airframe basis.
And perhaps related to that, here in the society, we've seen an enormous increase in the number of papers submitted for publication in the Aerospace Journal, our learned journal, where we get the cutting edge stuff. How is professional engineering regarded in China in terms of the equivalent of registration and belonging to an institution that regulates engineers?
The predominant driver of, let's say, ranking of individuals is certainly on what I would call a papers issue basis. And I'm not a great advocate, to be honest, because they tend to be, especially in China, it tends to be almost a regurgitation of other people's work. They're too focused on the numbers of papers being issued rather than the quality of the work involved. Of course, there are pockets of real, let's say, genuine frontier type of research, but the majority of papers, and you find that especially even at PhDs, I mean, we've got so many PhDs and postdocs in COMAC, but they haven't a clue how to actually develop and certify an airplane. You know, they can quote, and most of the newspapers, they can quote verbatim textbooks and so on, but they have no idea how to be productive and how to actually structurally analyze root cause of a problem, and to organize themselves, to be methodical, have a structured approach to how they undertake their tasks and their work. It's very much about still the state-owned enterprise philosophy and mentality, which they've been taught since kindergarten, is about pleasing your boss, doing the work in the way he's told you to do it. If you know a better way, well, it doesn't matter because that's what he's told you to do, and so on. And of course, avoidance of blame. You know, everyone will do anything to take any ownership or responsibility. It's always somebody else's problem, and they certainly wouldn't just jump into pitch in to help a colleague if he was in some technical area or technical difficulty. It's a completely different operational mindset, and that's part of the frustration that I've had when we're trying to instigate. In fact, I worked very closely with the president of the company, he's now the chairman actually, and he and I introduced IPTs after I'd been in the company around 18 months. It took him around 18 months to get enough support to change the whole business from a functional organization to an IPT-based organization. But even today, all these years later, the company still doesn't operate in a true IPT framework. And that's because that what they do know is how to operate in a very traditional functional-based organization. So that makes it very difficult to remove what I call silo working. But believe me, the top leadership, they understand it, they get it. The problem is instilling that change. And we're now back to the super tanker analogy, where you've got lots of layers of people who only know the state-owned enterprise way of working. And so it's very difficult, especially when you overlay that with risk avoidance, to persuade them to adopt a completely different way, an integrated approach of working.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting, and that was the cultural driver for us in the society to create what we call a representative office in China. This is comparatively recent, started in 2018, and courtesy of the University of Nottingham in China at Ningbo, we were able to work to produce a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese Society of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and then subsequently to do a similar agreement with other institutions, the Shanghai Society of Aeronautics being among them. It's a great, it opens a great window for us, because here is one of the oldest learned societies in the world in aerospace and aviation, and we have something to offer. And I know Tony Shen, our General Secretary from the China office, is on the in the audience there, but it was Tony who we owe a great deal to in pushing this forward. We also owe a great deal to you, Dennis. The number of questions always speaks to how engaging a presentation and a discussion has been, and they're still coming in. All of them start with thank you for that insight, the depth of the insight, etc. So we are indebted to you for giving your time, and it's striking that you made the point that operating in China is very much about long-term objectives, and it's not necessarily about commercial drivers. And in a way, that plays to the strength of aerospace, which itself is a long-term business, and the fact that there are funded programs. So before I just make any other announcements for the future program for corporate partners, I just give you the opportunity if you want to make any closing remarks, Dennis.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. No, it was really my pleasure to, although the time was rather limited, and certainly a lot of the aspects of operating here would need significant time to really get that understanding across. Of course, I am contactable on LinkedIn if anyone's got any particular requirements. But thank you again for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
And thank you again. The next two corporate partner meetings, I'll take in reverse order, as it were. We will be doing an event on the 8th of July, a virtual event, of course, actually centered on the UK's Tempest programme, entitled A Catalyst for Transformation. It's Michael Christie, who's the Director of Future Combat Air Systems at BAE Systems, and we will make the cut-off decision as to whether that's virtual or live towards the end of this month, but I wouldn't bet the farm on it being live. And then before that, but the date is yet to be unspecified, we're going to do a panel discussion to look at a quick snapshot of the individual and linked impact of the COVID situation on defence, on OEMs, civil OEMs, and also the MRO market, and finally the airplane leasing market, because we just want to look across the top and get a feel for how the whole of this sector is going to look in the future. So we will publish details on that in due course. In the meantime, Thanks to the audience for attending. You've come from far-flung corners of the earth, and we're very grateful for that. And Dennis, thanks again to you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.